Hi, welcome to Blogging Heads TV. You're watching Culturally Determined, and I'm your host, Aryeh Cohen-Wade. And my guest today is Owen Ellickson. Owen, could you introduce yourself?
Sure, I'm Owen Ellickson. I'm a TV writer. I did a bunch of fake dialogue tweets about Donald Trump last fall that got me a little bit of notoriety and the much coveted blue check on Twitter. And I'm a wrestling fan, which is, I believe, what we're going to be talking about today.
Yeah, so you were on Blogging Heads just within the last week or so on a conversation with Bob Wright, and you mentioned wrestling, and that's something I've kind of been interested in having a conversation with somebody about. And I said originally, maybe let's wait a couple weeks. You were just on. We don't want to get Owen overload. But then, lo and behold, we're taping this on Monday. Yesterday, on Sunday, Donald Trump sent out a tweet that probably everyone has heard about by now, involving a doctored video of him slamming someone to the ground, and it was the person's head was replaced with the CNN logo. And this is immediately I said, okay, we got to record right away. We got to jump on the news cycle. So when you saw this, what was your first reaction?
I felt a small frisson of delight at just the surreal nature of it. This was, just to give some context, this was from Trump's most high-profile interaction in wrestling. This was took place at WrestleMania 23 in April of 2007, and the CNN man he is choking and punching is WWE owner Vince McMahon. It was a match. Two wrestlers wrestled the match, but they were proxies for Vince and Trump. It was called the Battle of the Billionaires, and the billionaire whose wrestlers lost would get their head shaved. Vince McMahon lost. Donald Trump shaved his head. I would be hard pressed to call this great as a presidential. It's the things people are saying about it. I would generally agree with. It's embarrassing. It's not particularly responsible. I believe it came from a racist Redditor. Signal boosting.
That came out today. That's the person who put this thing together on Reddit also posted images of purported Jewish people who appear on CNN with Stars of David next to their faces, and his
saw that as well.
Has posted other offensive things. So I mean, it is. Do you think Trump looks at Reddit? I kind of think he probably doesn't know how.
No, I would imagine that's somebody in the sort of Scavino clan. In his, my sense is Dan Scavino does, if Trump does any sort of more Baroque, elaborate Twitter moves, Dan Scavino or somebody who works for Dan Scavino is probably behind it.
Right. So some other person brought this to his attention, and he obviously enjoyed it enough to send it out.
I would guess that's right. Yeah. I'm sure he would make the final call on something like that. Yeah. I guess the one thing I would maybe push back on in terms of what the sort of mainstream reaction to it has been is I don't think this, for me personally, this didn't strike me as a particularly dangerous call to violence, just in the sense that, it's monstrously silly. It's it is a logo being choked by a man. And I think, the people who tend to see it are Trump fans, but Trump fans who also follow him on Twitter, which, is easy to forget if you are, really avid on social media, that a lot of people are not on social media. Mm-hmm. I would imagine most Trump fans who are energetic on Twitter enough to see this are conversant enough in wrestling to just see that this is kind of like a fuck you joke. But I doubt this would galvanize a lot of people to take up arms. Some person with mental issues could do something based on it, but that could be true of almost anything. So I regarded it as like embarrassing, but when he says stuff like the media is the enemy of the American people, I regard that as actually more irresponsible than this. Although this is miles from responsible.
Yeah, I guess I would basically agree. I didn't see it as an incitement to violence. Although, there are mentally disturbed people who will take things and try to, enact their own bizarre fantasies based on things that leaders say, and Trump is definitely not a responsible leader. Just the absurdity of the situation was what struck me most of all. That this is real life. This is actually happening, and the most powerful man in the world is sending out weird memes like this. It's just very strange.
Yeah, and another element I would add, which will probably be a theme of our discussion, is it's a carefully edited clip where Trump is beating somebody up and being a big tough guy in the sort of limited way that he was able to as a non-athletic 6-year-old at the time. So I mean, I do think a lot of American pro wrestling in particular is male theater, and I think that Trump is really a master of that. I think that is a large reason of the fact that, especially, he won the Republican primary and in some part why he won the general election. So he likes looking like a big tough guy, and that is probably the 6 seconds of his life where he most looked like one from a certain perspective.
And so, when he got to be up behind the wheel of that big rig, did you see that picture?
Those may be the two peaks. So I think that I think that may have been a tiebreaker in him deciding to do it. It was not, I'm sure he's not delighted with how he's being covered in the media, but I think you could have put a number of things on the head there, and he might have been tempted to tweet it.
Okay, so moving beyond this specific instance, Trump is a historic figure. He's the first person ever to become president who did not come from either a previous elected office or the military. He's the oldest president. And like we said, he's the first president ever to participate in professional wrestling in his previous career.
Well, let me push back on that. One of the things you learn if you put energy into the history of professional wrestling is there are some wrestling historians, but in general, it's notoriously difficult to know what's real and what's not real because, these are folks who essentially do a form of lying for a living. So there are all these wonderfully colorful stories in wrestling that may or may not be real. Hulk Hogan will often talk about how he body slammed the 900-pound Andre the Giant in front of 3 million people, when in fact Andre was about 6'9", and it was about 80,000 people in the building. So all of that is a long-winded way of saying pro wrestling claims Abraham Lincoln as one of its own.
Oh, really?
Yes. He did a little bit of, and so far as I know, it may be correct that he did a little bit of wrestling as a young man. It was at a time where I think wrestling was generally not fixed. It being sort of a staged event started, as best people can tell, a little more than 100 years ago. So whether or not this is accurate, who knows? And I think most people in wrestling would say, who cares? But they would say that Donald Trump is the second president.
Okay, so the founder of the modern Republican Party and the person who's killing the modern Republican Party both have a wrestling history.
Wrestling there at the beginning and the end.
So how do you think Trump has used wrestling type skills, or how has wrestling informed what has happened over the past couple of years in American politics?
So Trump has a long relationship with wrestling. This is always I like to point out to people. Trump, as of today, follows 45 people on Twitter. 12 of them are either government officials or members of his staff. 13 of them are related business partners of his or properties that he owns. 12 are sort of movement conservatives of various types, Fox News icons, that sort of thing. 7 are family members, and the 45th and final one is Vince McMahon. He does not have an active business relationship with him. That is the only guy where there's no real that is by far the most tenuous connection that Trump has. I kind of think Vince is one of the closest things that Trump has to a friend. And I think that they just have sort of similar mindsets. And sort of a simplistic way of putting that is, who cares what's real or what's not real? What matters is what's hot, what's interesting. I don't think Trump learned that from wrestling. I think, there are a lot of stories about Fred Trump. He plastered all of Queens with the name Trump. I mean, I think Trump is, a self-branding kind of artifice over reality guy to his core. But I think he sort of saw a kindred spirit in Vince McMahon and probably learned some things from him. So, yeah, I think that sort of ethos of what is interesting mattering more than what is true, I think that was a thing that Trump rode to great success. I think that in some ways you could, if you assume that a sort of cynicism in a lot of voters, which is saying all these people are full of shit, Trump in some ways made the implicit argument that, look, if we're all full of shit, just pick the one who's the most fun. And that's me.
Uh-huh.
That's by no means the main thing that happened last year. I mean, I think a lot of the bigotry that he espoused was part of it, and just sort of traditional partisan tribalism was part of it. But I think in a lot of ways he looked at a Republican primary where, a lot of people are fudging things and misrepresenting what's actually going on and their positions on things. And that happens on the Democratic side too. But Trump said, well, look, if we're all lying, I can lie the hardest and the loudest and the best. Mm-hmm. And it was a very entertaining package. I mean, a lot of us lamented the degree to which he dominated media coverage, but I mean, I defy you to go to a Rubio rally and find it as interesting as a Trump rally, just as sort of a bit of theater. So I think that just sort of bigger, badder, and who cares what actually is happening underneath. I think that is something that Trump is a real master of. That's something when I think people say he's dumb, I think, they're like not giving that enough due, because he ran circles around a bunch of established politicians. And that is very wrestling-y, and part of the reason he's been a real success in wrestling in his cameos there.
Mm-hmm. Let's take the point of whether he's dumb or not, because I think that is an interesting point. I think he is dumb, and I think he's in the early stages of some kind of cognitive decline. Just if you watch old clips of him, they make a lot more sense than the way he talks today. But he's canny, and he's a good con man.
Yes.
And kind of like pulling a con does seem like it has something to do with being a successful wrestler.
I think that's right. Yeah. I mean, I would largely agree that certainly from a lot of perspectives he is dumb. I mean, smart and dumb, I feel like is, they risk being, it's such a simplistic metric, but he's certainly incurious in a way that is horrifying for somebody who's actually the most powerful person in the world.
Yeah. I mean, he watches cable news all day.
Yeah.
And
no. I mean,
so that takes a certain kind of mind. Yeah.
Yeah. His intellectual diet is pretty terrifying. And I say that as somebody who watches a couple of hours of wrestling a week. And I mean, I am not well equipped to speak on such matters, but I think the cognitive decline thing is probably true. But yeah, I mean, a lot of people wanted to win the Republican nomination. A lot of them spent a lot of money. Several of them spent more than he did. Most of them had spent decades in politics, and he beat them all. So I think it's easy and lazy to say that's because people are dumb. He certainly did a lot of scapegoating of minorities and whatnot, and that played a role. But Tom Tancredo and Pat Buchanan and other people have done that. He did it with a flair that people responded to. And I don't know that means he deserves credit, but I do think that's true. So,
why don't we talk about this concept called kayfabe? I actually learned about this from Freddie DeBoer, who I think referenced the critic Adolph Reed, who has written about this, kayfabe in politics. Can you define this term?
Well, I can define it in wrestling. In wrestling, it is basically that historically, wrestling was a big money sport around the turn of the 20th century and around 1900. Around that time, for various business reasons, it was largely a regional business where there was sort of a Missouri territory, a Georgia territory, a New York territory. So sometimes you just wanted your local star to beat a guy who visited, even if that guy was better. And so slowly matches started getting fixed for various reasons. Around that came a concept called kayfabe, which I think came from the carnival days, from the world of carnivals, which is there's a language called kayfabe, sort of a language that wrestlers used to use in the ring. It's, I think, not entirely gone, but largely gone. So they could communicate with each other about what they were going to do next without onlookers knowing what they were saying. But more generally, it means we need to put forward we need to give everybody the impression that this is real, that we really hate each other, that these matches are actually happening and we're trying to win. And the person who wins is the person who did the best, not the person who was told to win beforehand by some sort of storyteller. And that was something that, was predominant in wrestling until maybe the 80s when it started to weaken a little bit. There were things like good guys who are known as baby faces in the business and bad guys who are known as heels could never be seen together in public. Because if you were a fan, you would say, oh, well, they would obviously kill each other if they ever ran into each other. And in fact, two high-profile wrestlers, Hacksaw Jim Duggan and the Iron Sheik in the 80s, were pulled over with, I don't want to impugn them, I think marijuana in the car, and arrested. And they were fired not because of the drugs, but because it was a patriotic American and an evil Iranian in a car together. So they were fired not for their actual crime, but the crime of breaking kayfabe. So this is a concept that has weakened a little bit over the years, sometimes for mercenary reasons. That Vince McMahon realized that if he had the WWE classified as entertainment instead of sports, it would be taxed less in various states.
Okay.
But it is generally a thing that people sort of try to keep alive. But it's a little bit blown open, obviously. I mean, the internet makes it impossible to keep up any real mask for any real amount of time if somebody wants to look behind it.
Mm-hmm. But part of this is a sense of withholding of disbelief by the fans, right? Like the fans both know it's fake, but pretend it's real in order to enjoy it more. Yeah,
I think that I think that's right. I think you'll hear a lot of snickering in various circles about when wrestling comes up that like, oh, a lot of people don't even realize it's fake. I think that is actually kind of condescending and not really true, but I think most fans would tell you it's besides the point. I would say when wrestling is at its best, there's never a moment where I think it's real, but there are certainly moments where I don't care that it's fake. Is the way I would put it. Your favorite movie is fake. It was actors and it was set designers and it was all sorts of artificial elements put together. Generally, if you're really engaged in a story, you don't care that it's a story. You just are in a sort of the reverie of what is happening. Yeah. And I think most wrestling fans would put themselves into that category, that they get invested in it. But, if you put truth serum in them, they know that these guys are, there are basic sort of tropes in every match. There's a move called the Irish Whip where you push your opponent against the ropes and they run and then they run back to you. That's crazy. You couldn't get a human being to do that. There are just these things that wrestling fans sort of agree upon as these are things that we will accept within this context in order to enjoy this type of entertainment.
Yeah, it's interesting. What it makes me think is, if you were at a fashionable party and you were talking about the latest episode of Fargo or Better Call Saul or something, and then someone said, well, don't you know that's fake?
Exactly.
Or have you read the new novel? By Jonathan Safran Foer. Well, don't you know that's fake? Yes. But for wrestling, somehow the fakeness of it matters.
God bless you for saying that, Aryeh. That is a common refrain from wrestling fans. I think, a lot of wrestling is done badly, but I don't think it being fake is inherently a damning critique of it. A lot of things are fake, a lot of things are real. Whether it's good or not is, I think, a more salient question.
So why do you think wrestling is kind of in this category where it's seen as low class and it's not even seen as snobby to make fun of wrestling today?
Well, I think there's some path dependence to that. If you look at old wrestling matches from the 50s, you will see everybody in the audience is wearing suits and fancy dresses. It used to be, and continues to be in certain places. Wrestling is also big in Mexico and Japan, and I think particularly in Japan, it is still the fan base is sort of a higher economic class on average than here. I think there maybe is something about, there's a lot of talk these days about, like, for instance, the white working class and just these various sort of burning resentments that people may have about their lot in life. And I think you could argue that there's a sort of vicarious satisfaction you get through wrestling, so that, the more struggles you have in your life, the more you would get out of seeing sort of a cathartic play like that. But I think a lot of it is that there were a bunch of regional territories. They coalesced into three big companies, the AWA in the Midwest, the National Wrestling Alliance, which became WCW in the South, and then the WWF, now the WWE in New York. And then Vince McMahon and the WWE took over. They are now the national promotion, and they've just done a lot of dumb bullshit over the years. I think that a lot of what people think is dumb about wrestling relates back to that they've kind of dropped the ball in some ways. And some of that, the really colorful stuff they did was fun, and I enjoyed it at the time, but a lot of it was dumb in a way that is not inherently, doesn't have to be part of wrestling. And I think scared some, higher income people off. But I don't know. I mean, I'd be interested, for instance, I have no idea what this sort of economic demographic of soap operas is. I mean, soap operas really are pretty parallel to wrestling.
Yeah.
And whether there's some sort of pattern there or not, I don't know. But I think that there are a number of types of groups, generally higher income, who feel like that is not something one should pay attention to, and other people have fewer hangups about it. So,
so I was telling you earlier, when I was like a teenager, I was really into comic books and collected things like Magic the Gathering cards.
Braggart.
And even I, who was a super nerd, kind of looked down on the kids who are into wrestling as being like, "Oh God, these are the real losers." Do you think the cultural position of wrestling has changed in the past 20 years?
Well, it hasn't. It hasn't. I mean, ironically, when you were a teenager was probably one of the all-time highs in the history of the business. The year 2000, 2001, around there was WWE had the biggest years any wrestling company ever had. But I do think that they were also doing a lot of, it was a more xenophobic, racist, misogynistic product than it is now. It's fairly sanitized along those lines now, I would say, more often than not. I mean, I don't mean sanitized in that it's good that it's not those things to the same degree anymore. But so there certainly was when people would look at it, a lot of people would be like, well, why are these women having a bikini contest? What does that have to do with wrestling? Which is a fair question. But I think now it is a sort of more advertiser-friendly product. That's no accident. They make a lot of money selling toys, so they have sort of made it less violent in certain ways. Historically in wrestling, there was something called blading, where guys would hide a small razor blade in their trunks, and then they would cut themselves at a moment when people couldn't see their face. When there was blood, historically in wrestling, it was actually their blood, which horrifies a lot of people. And so for that reason and many others, they got rid of that. But there are a lot of things like that now. So I think it's more respectable. And the WWE has made a deal with ESPN, so it's now covered on SportsCenter. There are various ways in which they've kind of gotten a little more mainstream cultural sign-off in various ways. But the actual product is not all that popular right now in a weird way. And I would actually say in ways that relate to Trump. As Trump took over and became president, saying things none of us ever thought a president would say, the WWF has actually gotten very corporate and straight-laced. Every interview basically sounds the same. I mean, I think, if you remember wrestling from when you were a little kid at all, a staple of 80s wrestling was, none of us as kids thought about it at the time, was just guys coked out of their minds saying insane things. And it was really colorful, and it's pretty fun to watch just a human being on a bunch of cocaine just saying a bunch of random garbage. I'm not accusing Trump of doing drugs, but that is kind of what he does. I mean, it is compelling. He is the first president in memory where he'll start saying something and it could go anywhere at all.
Right.
That kind of thing was sort of a staple of wrestling, that it had this sort of outlaw feel. It was less controlled than other types of entertainment you could find on television and in person. And they've tried to cut down on that, which I think is a real mistake. I feel like if it's not satisfying some sort of outlaw wild urge, then it doesn't really serve a cultural purpose, in my opinion. I sort of like wrestling when it's wild and a little dirty and whatever.
I didn't realize it was being covered on SportsCenter. I mean, do you think of it as a sport, or do you think of it as a performance?
I think of it as a performance. I think there are forces within ESPN that are chagrined by that. I mean, I think it is a much more difficult type of performance than a lot of people appreciate. I, in my younger days, took a couple of pro wrestling classes and was shocked by how hard it was. I sat on the head of a man named Diamante and realized I was not cut out for it. You have to be a real athlete, and it hurts a lot. But yeah, I mean, it's in the ways that we consider a sport, it is not a sport. It is entirely predetermined. But there are, like one of the most famous wrestlers of all time is a guy named Ric Flair, and his character is a guy who loves limousines and champagne and pretty women. And his real name is Ric Flair, and he really loves limousines and champagne and pretty women. These things blur a little more in the world of wrestling than I think some people realize. The most effective wrestling characters are the ones that are very close to the actual personalities of the performers. So I think it is an interesting type of performance, but I think it safely falls into the category of performance as opposed to sport.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk a little bit about heel versus face. So I sent you a tweet that someone did replying to Trump's video where I think the tweet was, it's always bad when a heel thinks he's a face.
Yes.
So it's always when a villain thinks he's a hero. And
yes,
whether Trump is a hero or a villain depends on your politics, I guess. But he acts more like a heel, wouldn't you say, than like a heroic wrestler?
Yes. Well, and I think in some ways, so this is another interesting thing about wrestling so traditionally your baby faces are sort of these clean cut wrestlers who play by the rules and, kiss babies and high five the fans as they walk to the ring and whatnot. And the heels are guys who take shortcuts and they cheat, and sometimes they're from a different country. Sometimes they're rich. It's sort of like if you think of all the sort of types of people that Trump maligned on the campaign trail, that's a pretty good taxonomy of who would make wrestling heels back in I guess except for Nazis, who used to be a huge form of heel and vilified Nazis, really as much as you would hope he would have. So that definition has blurred a little bit in the last 20 years. A guy named Stone Cold Steve Austin, who's one of the big recent stars, was kind of one of the main people who helped blur that, where he was presented as a bad guy and sort of an amoral, cheating, aggressive jerk, but he was just so goddamn interesting that fans started cheering him. So there is a little bit of a blurring, and I think Trump. Well, I mean, so this will sound like a random aside, but hopefully it will connect back. And if not, I apologize to you and to our listeners. A brilliant angle that was done 20 years ago was a rivalry between Steve Austin and a wrestler named Bret Hart, who was Canadian. Bret Hart was a legend, beloved in Canada and here in the States, and he was wrestling Steve Austin. And Steve Austin was just so charismatic and strange and funny that even though he was being a jerk, he was getting cheered more than Bret Hart was. So the WWF ran with that in a brilliant way, and they had Bret Hart turn on the American audience and say, I've been wrestling for you people for 15 years, and this jerk comes along. He ruins my life. He slams an ambulance door on my leg, yada, yada, yada. And you people all cheer him. I still love my fans in Canada, in Europe, around the world. But as far as I'm concerned, you Americans can shove it. And a rivalry began in which Bret Hart was the babyface and Steve Austin was the heel in every country except for this one. And here, Steve Austin was the red-hot babyface and Bret Hart was the heel. So they realized that they could do both at the same time depending on which audience they were covering. And I think Trump is pretty good at that. I think there are, in our polarized culture, no consensus good guys and bad guys in American politics. Trump is a bad guy in, most circles I travel in, and I imagine you as well, but obviously very much a good guy in other circles. I think that he is very good, but I think that his default whine mode certainly sounds like a bad guy when all he does is complain about how he's being treated. You especially, that I think tends to rankle from somebody who has it all. And so I think his complaints about being mistreated by the media are less effective for him in the White House than they were on the road to the White House when he could paint himself as an underdog. I mean, he's just not really a plausible underdog in any way at this point. He is, again, the most powerful human being on earth.
Yeah.
So I think that he certainly, by my moral code, is a bad guy, a heel. To his fans, he is a good guy of sorts, but a lot of it is that, people would sometimes say, why do sort of working class Americans feel like this billionaire understands them? And I think on some level, the answer is often they don't think he understands them. They just love how much he hates the people that they also hate. Mm-hmm. And I think that, the lifeblood of wrestling really is hatred. I think especially in America, I think an American company where everybody was a good sport and they shook hands before and after the matches, I think that company would go out of business really quickly.
So hatred may be the lifeblood of American politics, at least in our current era as well.
Like we're in a moment where that is truer than ever. That there are various fissures within the American left right now. I think they seem more pronounced on a place like Twitter than they necessarily are in real life. But nothing heals those more than Donald Trump. Everybody can pull together because fuck that guy.
Yeah.
I think that's true on the right as well. Obviously hating Barack Obama was an organizing principle for the right for 8 years. And when Trump is in trouble, he tries to pick something that people hate. Right now he's picking the media, thus the clip that brought us here. But so I think that the heel face distinction is interesting in that heels really kind of do drive the wrestling business, and I think they are driving the political business right now too. I think negative partisanship is the classy term for what we're talking about.
Yeah, so people are united around what they're against, not what they're for.
Yes. I think I know a lot of people who are ambivalent about the Democratic Party, but are aghast, and I would put myself in this camp, I guess, are aghast at the prospect of the Republican Party having power on any level. And that right. They would say that motivates them more than, fondness for the Democratic Party. So
why don't we talk about someone who's been kind of a dark horse possible candidate in the year 2000 for president. And this is a person known as Dwayne The Rock Johnson.
Yeah. So I don't even know about dark horse.
Right. So he was on the cover. There was a cover story that was very entertaining. Katie Weaver, is that the author's name?
Yes.
In GQ magazine, we'll link to it below. A profile of Dwayne Johnson, formerly known as The Rock, although he'll always be The Rock to me.
As to me.
And it's just a great piece of journalism, but it kind of portrays him as the most likable, charismatic, enthusiastic, kind of all-American guy who's ever lived. And if you talk to him for 5 minutes, you feel like he's known you for 5 years and he's your best friend.
Yes.
Do you think there's anything to this that he could try to pursue a political office?
I think there may be. I think it would not happen. My guess is, so I love The Rock. I find him incredibly nourishing as a public figure. He is a delightful wrestler, a wonderful cheesy actor, a delightful cheesy social media user. My guess is in the short term, he will use the few years he has left to be incredibly muscular to make a few more movies and whatnot. But that down the line, my sense is that he would think about it. I mean, this was within wrestling. The joke was always that The Rock would be president. As early as the year 2000. I think he might be able to do it. Weirdly, I think he would have more upside as a sort of reform Republican than as a Democrat. One hallmark is he is incredibly comfortable in sort of corporate paradigms. Mm-hmm. He's like the best. Nobody is better at promoting their own movies than The Rock. He's an excellent sort of spokesperson for, I think, Ford and just various things. I think that he would. I think, to use simplistic terms, the Bernie crowd would find him very suspect and corrupt in terms of, he travels very comfortably in sort of big business circles. He makes a lot of money. He's comfortable with making money. So I actually think he might have more potential as a Republican down the line. But I think he's an incredibly smart guy. I think he's very charismatic. I think he he certainly seems empathetic. The degree to which he is, I suppose, is debatable. But I mean, he seems like a very nice guy, and if he comes across as a very nice guy, then that would be what matters electorally.
Yeah, being able to fake sincerity is a key part of life, and especially in politics. That's something Mitt Romney couldn't do.
Yes,
but
exactly.
A successful politician like Obama can do it.
And I do think that I think that there's a lot of macho bullshit left in America. I think that helps Trump. I mean, I don't think Hillary Clinton was a perfect candidate, and I think she made a lot of mistakes, but I do think misogyny was in the mix. And I think that The Rock would certainly profit from those metrics. I don't know that he would necessarily use them, but just the optics of him against anybody at a podium, if you are somebody who instinctively wants the toughest person who could keep America safe, The Rock certainly looks like that guy. So I think, if he were serious about it, I think he could make things a little bit interesting. I mean, I probably wouldn't bet on him ever becoming president, but we're certainly living in a world where the possible set of presidents is bigger than we thought it was a couple of years ago.
Yeah. The game done changed when Trump became president. So who knows what's going to come next? Okay, so let's say The Rock decides to keep on making G.I. Joe movies and doesn't throw in his hat in the year 2020, and let's also assume that Trump is still president and is running for re-election, which I do not think is a safe bet, but who knows what will happen. What advice will you have for his eventual Democratic counterpart based on your knowledge of wrestling and of how Trump has used the politics of wrestling or the wrestling of politics to win in 2016?
It's a good question. I mean, I would say that, I think that probably, and I say this as a wrestling fan, wrestling helped get us into this mess. I'm not sure that it will help get us out. But I would say that I'm a big fan of Elizabeth Warren politically. And I think that she actually is very good at, and she is a big fan of The Rock, incidentally. She's a big fan of the show Ballers, which is one of the biggest sort of non sequitur fandoms I've ever heard of. But
people on Twitter were floating Warren Johnson 2020. Yes,
exactly. I think she is very good at, I think there are a number of reasonable arguments on both sides about how she would fare as a candidate, but I think she is very good at attacking Trump along metrics that bother him. She will say he's weak, he's a scared little boy, stuff like that. That stuff really gets under his skin. I think that accusations of corruption and stuff like this, I said this when I talked to Bob, but I think there are certain things that are bad about Trump that are not interesting to a lot of voters on a sort of elemental wrestling-y type level. I think him being corrupt, they think, well, he's my guy. My guy can be a little dirty. He's fun. That's just part of the fun. He's, if he's corrupt, he's doing it to help people like me. Certainly there's no evidence that that's true, but he can try to get that across. But the idea that he's actually weak and kind of a fool and, not a sort of potent, virile man, those are not noble attacks. I would love to see a Democrat take the White House without having to resort to those, but I think those work. I think Warren drives Trump crazy in a certain way, and there's a saying that styles make fights. I think she is well designed to sort of take him down a notch. So I think something like that could help. But in some ways, I think that the right candidate to beat Trump is somebody who just says, aren't we sick of all this wrestling bullshit?
A return to normalcy.
Yeah, like, sort of a kind of bland, serious person might actually be the right antidote for this. I mean, it's been a hell of a ride, but I think I, for one, have not enjoyed it. And I think a lot of people would say the same, including a lot of Republicans, probably, especially by 2020.
Yeah, and it's only been 5 months so far. There are a few kind of public figures in public life that I admire more than Michelle Obama, but that thing she said about when they go low, we go high, that was just really stupid politics. And for Hillary Clinton to make that a mantra of her own campaign, she lost, so her strategy wasn't good. But even at the time, it was like, in wrestling terms, it'd be like if the guy who like throws sand in the face of the ref, and then the good guy is trying to just still play by the rules when the bad guy is breaking the rule book.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think that I mean, I think it was good first lady posturing. I think, the first lady, it's that is probably a role where it's good to play it pretty clean. But
Right.
yeah, it's interesting. Hillary, I think, never found the right mix in that a lot of people went in and came out thinking she was corrupt. I think, there's some truth to that. I think a lot of it is bullshit. But there were certain types of attacks Hillary did not make or could not make in the right way that might have helped. I mean, I think maybe I'm sort of veering us off topic here, but I feel like she wanted to portray herself as sort of the clean fighter, and Trump was able to make it so dirty that it felt like there wasn't a clean fighter. So she never really got electoral credit for that.
Yeah, I that makes sense. And yeah, I think she wasn't able to get rid of her image as being someone who's crooked, as Donald Trump termed her as. And yeah, it was like, if we're both dirty, vote for the one who has got your back and cares about you. And Clinton wasn't able to effectively combat that, or effectively enough.
Yeah, and one extra note: his monikers of Little Marco, Lion Ted, Crooked Hillary, things like that, actually are very reminiscent of wrestling. Ravishing Rick Rude, Dangerous Danny Davis. There are a lot of wrestling names where you just slap one extra word on there and you get who that character is. If they come to your town, you know what to do. You know whether that's a good sounding thing or a bad sounding thing.
Uh-huh.
So I think there are certain just simple visceral things that wrestling provides that Trump knows how to provide as well. And opponents of his would do well to understand those and respect them.
You must have seen this story about, there's a guy calling himself the progressive liberal wrestler.
Yes.
Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think that's a tremendous gimmick. I believe it's in Kentucky, so that seems like a well-chosen spot for that gimmick. I think that's very funny. Yeah, I think there's. I mean, the funny thing is that I think wrestling, largely because it is a pretty low-income and therefore very ethnically diverse fan base, is actually, I think, has a more liberal fan base than any major American sport. But certainly there are bastions of the South where wrestling was always big in the South, which is another thing that connects to Trump's appeal down there, where I think that would play tremendously well. And I mean, there are certainly type Twitter personae, fans of basically every candidate. It sees itself wanting to see punched in the face. I think it's a pretty smart gimmick. I have not seen him wrestle. I've heard his gimmick is better than his in-ring skill, but yeah, I'm curious to check out more of him.
Yeah, so well, maybe he'll be a dark horse candidate for 2020.
Could be.
So I think that's all I have. I apologize for my dog barking. Something's going on outside.
Yeah.
So thanks, Owen, for coming on again.
Thank you, Art.
If there's anyone out there who wants to learn more about you or about wrestling, maybe what would you recommend?
I don't know if I would recommend my Twitter account, but you can go find it. I'm at Owen Ellickson on Twitter. In terms of wrestling, I mean, the easiest way to find it is WWE has shows Monday and Tuesday night on the USA Network. I think they're a mixed bag for a million reasons that I could speak about for weeks. But yeah, I think with wrestling, you just kind of dive in and see what you think. There is a saying, and nobody knows who said it first about wrestling, but to those who get it, no explanation is necessary. To those who don't, no explanation will ever be enough. So if you, the listener, already don't like wrestling, I probably won't be able to talk you into it. But if you've always been intrigued, go take a look. Why not?
Okay, cool. So thanks, Owen, for coming on. Thanks to all of our viewers and listeners. We're on YouTube now, so if you want to leave a comment on YouTube or share the video to the YouTube link, it'll be easy to share in your social media feeds. And give us a rating on iTunes. Blogging Heads are culturally determined in particular. It's a way that the iTunes algorithm decides which things to show to people who are searching for various topics. So that's a way that more people can discover the show. So thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.